Hello, my front-end friends. Spacing on the web is something that should be easy, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. So in this video, we're going to be talking about a bunch of stuff related to spacing, starting with the ones that everybody knows, margins, and also talking a bit about gap and which one you want to use when, because they each have a different role to play. With margins, we'll get into collapsing margins, when and when they don't happen. We're going to get into some modern CSS as well, talking about text box trim and where things might be going as, that becomes a thing now that browsers are starting to support it. And most importantly, I think, is talking about strategies for dealing with spacing in different situations as they can come up. So depending on what you're working on, you have a plan of attack right away. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to start by talking about flow, because the reason we have margins at all and why they're on by default is because we want flow with our text. We're going to ignore the column that my head is on top of right now. We're just going to look at this middle column for now. And you can see all of this here, like there's spacing coming in here, even though we haven't done anything. And it's because we have margins on our elements by default. And as long as you've been doing web development for a little while, you're probably quite aware that all of these margins, we have a margin top and a margin bottom on all of these elements, and these are all there by default. Now, these default margins are actually kind of interesting and might not work in the way that you'd think, but they result in a good type of flow. And so if we come in here and we take a look at my paragraph there, and I select it, and we come into the dev tools and we take a look here, well, we're going to see a margin block start and a margin block end of 1em. And on our text elements, the margin top and bottom is always going to be, first of all, the default now is using the block start and block end, which are the logical properties. But we're also going to be seeing that they're always in em. So if you make your font size bigger, the margins will increase with it. And this is the same for all your headings as well, though our H1 here at the top, if we come and take a look at it, the margin top and bottom is actually a little bit smaller. It was probably done this way to prevent really gigantic margins if you go in with larger font sizes. At least that's what I would imagine the reason that on our H1, the default is a little bit smaller, but it's still an M. So as that font size increases, the size of the space around it will also increase. The other thing that's really important here is we have collapsing margins at play. And we're going to talk more about collapsing margins in a little bit as well. But if I look at this paragraph here and I look at this paragraph here, their margins are touching each other, but they're not pushing against each other. And when we have block level elements, like the parent is a block level element, and these are also block level elements here, obviously our paragraphs, this is called regular flow, and in regular flow, margins collapse into each other, meaning if two margins touch, the margins will merge into one. We won't get a double margin, so we don't get double spacing. So if I look at my H1, which has the bigger one, and I have this smaller one here, we can see which one, neither one is winning, it's just the H1 is bigger, so the paragraph one goes into it a little bit. And just, as I said, makes it so we don't have double spacing. Now, having a margin on the top and bottom like this, with regular flow actually works half decently, especially with the collapsing margins. And so in the old time of the web when this was decided on, everything worked really well. But with modern web development, having a margin top and bottom on all of our text elements can sometimes get kind of annoying, right? I'm sure you've run into situations with it where you get extra spacing around things, like here the margin top that you don't actually want on the first element and other things like that. So one thing that a lot of people do is have a reset where they select everything and they say margin 0 and they take all their margins off. And while this works, quite clearly we have no margins left. The problem that comes with this is then we have to reintroduce flow into our documents. And there's different approaches and different ways that we can do this. One of the simple ones is, instead of doing this, you could select your text elements. So say our H1, our H2, H3, you get the idea. Let's just do our paragraphs, but you'd select anything that has that. And instead of removing all of them, you could say that it's a margin block end of 0. Now that is going to leave the extra margin top on the first element, but it keeps that natural flow going through the entire document, and it does remove that double margin issue. So if you want to be less heavy-handed, this is definitely one way that you can accomplish that. And I think it works relatively well as a general rule. But for now, we're actually going to go back to having the star 0, just because I know this is such a common approach, and talk about a couple of different ways that we can deal with it. And this is where the concept of flow becomes very important. Because one thing people like to do, and I have this column here and this column here for this example, where I have a div of regular flow. They all have the same content in them. And then I have a div with consistent flow here. for lack of a better name. And we're going to talk about the selectors I'm using in a second and how they're working. But you'll notice on this one, I'm putting a margin top of 1em, and we could use the logical property as well, a margin block start instead. And we could use the logical property down here, since I'm trying to get better at using logical properties for everything I'm doing. And basically what these are doing, and I'll talk specifically about this in a second, but I'm just selecting almost every element and adding a margin to the top of them. And here we're adding 1em, and here we're adding 1rem. And this is the M, remember, was the default coming from the user agent styles, where 1rem is consistent no matter what, because it's going to the root font size. And I'm going to move myself out of the way a little bit here, just so you can notice, like if I scroll down here, notice how this is no longer aligning with this paragraph right here. And it gets even more highlighted with these. The further down we go, the more different the two columns are. And the reason for that is, here I have 1em, so my margin is equivalent to the font size. And this is actually something you want if you have regular flow. So blog articles, anything that has lots of text in it, heavy text things, basically, you want to have this type of flow because it helps with hierarchy. Where if you look at magazines or anything that has really nice typesetting in it, you'll notice when you have a heading, that heading is always closer to the content it's related to than the content that came before it, because this heading is not related to this here. So I want a larger space here than I do underneath it. So by doing this, I'm saying that the margin start, the margin on top of it, is 1em, and this doesn't have a margin underneath it. The margin's coming from the paragraph. The paragraph is smaller, so it gets a smaller space. Whereas if we look at where I did the consistent spacing with 1rem, everything's always the same. And in certain contexts, this is what you want, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. But again, when you have just regular flow content, very heavy text content, it's not as nice, and it doesn't have the same visual appeal, and it's a little bit harder to read. And we want to follow the good rules of design when we're doing things, and this is a really nice way to do it. And this is actually very similar to the prose. If you do a prose in Tailwind, in that case, it reintroduces a margin top and bottom, I believe, when you use the prose, but it's the same type of idea, and it is using M for that to bring in a more consistent spacing. The one difference, I believe, with the prose is it does it for everything. Like it does it for that element and the children and everything inside of there. It doesn't stop one level deep. This is called the lobotomized owl right here, and I'm using it for both of them. And the lobotomized owl is something that Hayden Pickering termed. What we're going to do is let's put a border of 2 pixels solid red on here, and everything is going to get that border on there except for the first element all the way at the top, because this is selecting every element. You have your star selector. If I did this, it would be every single element. So my first one gets it, plus star. And now the first child that's inside my regular flow, because I have the regular flow on there, so with the selector, isn't getting it, because it's saying every single element that comes directly after another element. So the first one has no sibling before it, so because it has no sibling before it, we don't select it. I know some people don't like this for readability purposes. I find it works really well, and by using the star selector, you're not artificially boosting specificity for no reason. So I'm sort of a fan of using this one. You can accomplish the same thing though by using a not first child, and that will accomplish exactly the same thing, but we are boosting specificity here. If you wanted to, you could also wrap it in a where pseudo class. Then I just find that the star plus star is fine. And if you're worried about readability or somebody not knowing what this is doing, you could leave a really quick comment and let them know exactly what it's for, if that's a concern. Now, one thing I would do if I had this, and I wouldn't call this regular flow, usually I just call it flow like that, which I think I got from Andy Bell. And the other thing there that you'd probably want to do here is actually do a var, and you could do var and do a flow here and then do a 1em. And what that means is by default, you'll have your 1em spacing, because this is the fallback for a flow, or this could be like flow spacing. That's usually what I call it. So I'd go in with a flow spacing or something like that to say what my spacing is going to be, but it means that if I have a component or something in a specific area where I need the flow to be larger or smaller, it's very easy to accomplish, because I just need to declare a custom property on it, either as an inline style if it's the only thing I'm changing, or if I have a class selector already, I could change that. So just as an example, let's come up here and I could say style is equal to, and then do var, flow spacing like that, and then we'll just make it really big to exaggerate and just show that now we're going to get double spacing, or we'll, I said exaggerate. When you exaggerate something, you should make it really, really big, and then we can change our flow spacing that way, or again, through a class selector. Whatever works, modify our classes, those types of things. And this type of visual flow, and we're going to take off the red boxes on there so we don't have them. But this type of normal flow we have, where we have larger spacing and smaller spacing and all these different things, is one of the reasons I don't like using grid and using gap for spacing, which I see a lot of people do, even for articles or other things, because it becomes easy. You do margin 0, add a gap on it, and then everything gets spaced out. But then you end up with something similar to what we have on this side, which isn't what I want. Again, heavy text, articles, things that are flow content, articles and blog posts and things people are going to be reading, you want to have a bit more of a natural flow like we have on the left here. Now, there are times where you do want consistent flow though. And so we're going to jump over to this example right here. To take a look at that. And I have a little bit more text than you traditionally might have in a card like this one right here. But I want to use that just to highlight the flow that we can have in something like this. And we're going to use this for, you can see my text box here, so a little bit of foreshadowing of things we're coming up to. And before we dive into turning on the margin here, let's move this H2 up to the top over here. And lead to one of the reasons why we often do a margin 0, because we don't want that space up here at the top. And of course, I could come in with that flow class like I was talking about before to give us that, we add a margin top to everything except for the first element. And that's one of the reasons it can be useful in areas, because we don't want this to have a margin on the top because it gets in the way. So often we end up doing a margin 0 to remove it, and then we have to build it all back in. So that's one of the reasons that we often see things like this. Now, before I get into that, one other thing that I do want to mention is on my card, I have some padding right now, and I want to take that off just because I want to mention one more thing about collapsing margins that I didn't say before. So we're going to take that off, and I have a border on here as well that we're going to turn off. And when I do that, if I go on my H2 and we say margin top is, let's say, 300 pixels, we'll make it pretty big. Just because I see people do this a lot, and not this much, but they want to move the text down within a space that has a background on it. Often it's when you have like a background image, so you have a div with a background image and you're trying to build in the extra space there. And so on the text, they put a margin top, but then the whole element moves. And this is collapsing margins, the weird part. Before was the easy part, where an element here and an element here, their margins will collapse into each other if they're touching. Well, what's happening is my H2 margin is also touching the margin of my card, because they're both at the same point. The top of both of them is at the exact same point right now. So if I add margin to my H2, it's touching the margin of my div, and they're merging the two margins together, and the entire thing moves down. This is definitely one of the frustrating things with collapsing margins. It's just a strange behavior that we need to know about when it comes to CSS, and the simple fix for it is, if you do need extra spacing, if you need more background image, for example, use padding instead. That's what we should be using. So if I did want this, instead of doing it on my H2 there, I would, on my card, do a padding top of 300 pixels. And then I'd give myself the empty space that I wanted. So more background, whether it's an image or just solid background, whatever it is, we want to use padding. Now, when I first did this, we can just delete this padding that's right here, turn this padding back on, and let's put this margin top back on there, and we see the whole thing is going to move down as well. And now this is working. And I know some people will sometimes do like a padding or a border of 1 pixel to get rid of collapsing margins, because as soon as we have padding or a border on the card, so on the parent, the margin of the two elements isn't touching anymore. We've pushed that element down, there's the padding now, and then we have the margin of one of them, and then we have the margin of the other one. So they're two separate things, and now it works within that space. But I would still say, don't do that, just add the padding to the card itself in the first place, please. And then we get something going like this, which works perfectly fine. The other thing with collapsing margins that can sometimes get a little bit annoying is they're not always going to collapse. So let's come and put my border back on. Let's get rid of this margin top because we really don't need it. And we go back to just the regular flow, the way it was going before. But then we come in with something like display grid. And when I do a display grid on there with actually I added a gap. We're going to remove that gap because that's adding space. But we can see that some of my spacing is really big. My space here looks fine, but my space around this thing is huge. And that's because if we're using grid or flexbox, the margins of the direct children, so our flex items, those no longer merge or collapse into one another. And we're also creating a new formatting context, which I don't want to get too much into, but it just means that we won't collapse outside of that element either. So if I turn off my border and my padding, the margin of this element is still not combining with the parent anymore. So collapsing margins don't always collapse. They collapse in regular flow, but they will not collapse if they're grid or flex items. So if we do our little inspect on this one, we can see that those margins are butting up against each other and we get double spacing happening, which we don't want. And that's another reason why we often come in with something like a margin of 0 to get rid of all the spacing, and then we come in with our gap to reintroduce that spacing. And in this way, by doing it, we're doing it in a way that's consistent throughout the entire element. But again, often what we do is we have a margin 0 on everything. I'm doing the margin 0 just because, again, it's the most common pattern that I do see. And in this case, if I do want to have equal spacing through something, like you usually do want to have in a card, because a card isn't something that has like a regular flow document like you would with an article or something that's very text heavy. Cards, usually it's one image, one heading, a paragraph, and a button, or things like that, where you don't actually want different spacing through it because you're not trying to build hierarchy. The hierarchy is already built into the element that you're dealing with. And so because of that, that's a really nice place to come in with something like grid. And my gap is probably way too big here, so let's drop it down to 1, maybe a 1.5 in this case. But we use the display grid, which is just handy because everything is stacked right away. So we could also use Flexbox for this. The disadvantage of Flexbox is then you also have to change the flex direction. With grid, nothing happens unless you declare columns, so we can see that's coming together right now. And then we throw a gap on there, and then that gap can come through and be whatever the gap is we need it to be, and we have a consistent gap that's being built in, which is exactly what we want. And these are the types of situations where I think having consistent flow and consistent spacing is perfect and exactly what you want. If you have a Figma design, that's going to be how the designer did it. They probably used autoflow and just equally spaced everything already anyway, so it works out really well. But there can be a few little gotchas even when you come in with this. Like right now, my button has stretched the entire width. There's a few ways that you could fix that with the way you do alignment within here, because we're using grid, so we can do an align items and justify content. It would be justify items start, justify content start, one of them. Even me, I write CSS all the time. I never remember which one it is. I have to do both. Another strategy is to come in with a paragraph and just have the link all the way at the bottom inside a paragraph, so it's inside of something, and then it doesn't stretch the whole way across. There's a few different things you can do with that. Depends on the situation, the design system that you're working within. There's a lot of different approaches that you could take there. I don't necessarily think one is better than the other, so it's up to you how you'd want to approach that. I tend to not actually put links by themselves in paragraphs, though semantically speaking, like it's basically a sentence. I don't really think it's an issue if it's its own paragraph. So if this type of thing works and it's the simplest solution, I think that's fine. I'm going to leave it in here because I want to show a side effect of something we're going to look at a little bit later if we do take this approach though. And I want to focus actually on that button right now. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit, but I'm sure you can see the issue that we have with it, where it's not equally spaced on the top and the bottom. And I purposely picked a font that exaggerates it. My button is with Josephine Saz, which is extraordinarily known for this weird spacing thing it has, just because of the space it has for descenders. Now it's not happening now because I have my text set in all caps, but their descenders are really low, so it leaves a lot of room under the baseline, which normally works. But as soon as you do all cap, you get this happening. But I'm sure you've seen this with buttons in the past as well. So I'm going to select my button. We're going to say button, and we're going to come on the padding of this. And what often ends up happening, and again, it's usually not this exaggerated, but we end up with a padding of something like 0.5. I'm just going to go with rem, but M would be fine here as well. 0.5 rem on the top. If this was in pixels, that would also work. Let's do 1.5 rem on the left and the right, and we're going to make it a lot bigger. Or actually, that looks like it was the same on the top. But yeah, it looks huge on the bottom and small there, even though it's the same. So what ends up happening is then you end up with like a 0.25 rem here to shrink the size on the bottom to try and balance it out. You basically have to magic number your way to the right amount. And that is a solution. I won't lie. Just because of the way fonts work and font rendering works, that's often something that we actually do have to do. Now, one thing sometimes you'll see people do is play with line height. In reducing line height, you can sometimes reduce You reduce the top and the bottom, but it's a little bit more balanced. But if you have a font like we have right now, where the top and the bottom is so drastically different, like we can see right now, you do have to magic number your way there. Either the top or the bottom, you have to play with it just to try and visually do it. And it's very, very frustrating. But luckily, there's new features that are coming to CSS now. They're landing in browsers. As I'm recording this, it's currently in Chrome and in Safari. So just keep an eye on the browser support for it. And it is one of those things that, depending on how you're using it, it might not matter if the browser support's not there. It could just be a progressive enhancement. You want to be a little bit careful, though, if you decide to start implementing it right now. But something just to remember for the future. If you're watching this early on, or if you're watching this in the future, check your browser support tables and see. It might be something that you can start using, which is our text box. And this text box property is actually a shorthand for text box trim, and a second one that is our text box edge, like this. And the trim is saying what sides of the element do you want to trim things on. And to highlight this, we're actually going to just go with a big amount of padding on here. So we can see the top and bottom, they're both different. Let's go with a 2 rem on there, just to make it really, really big. I think this is going to highlight it a little bit better. So the trim is saying, where do we want to remove the empty space? And if I come and I select this text, there we go. With it selected there, you can see there's a small amount of extra space on the top of the font and a lot of space underneath it. And that's what's causing this imbalance between the top and the bottom. And our padding is being added. Like if you look at that darker blue box, the padding is equal on the top and bottom there. But because we have that empty space, it visually doesn't look like that. And that just is different in every single font. And those spaces are there for good reasons, because on the top, they leave extra space for things like accents. And on the bottom, as I said, descenders, like the bottom of a lowercase j or a y that's sticking out the bottom, they need the space to render those things. So there's always some space on the top and the bottom that on our buttons and other things makes them look like they're on balance. And so what the text box trim is saying, do we want to cut off the top, or do we want to cut off from the bottom, or do we want to cut off from both? So we can say trim start, we can say trim end, or we can say trim both. And I think most of the time we do things, we're going to be using trim both, because we're going to want to trim off both of them. But it is possible that you might want to trim from one or the other. And then you need to give on our text box edge what you want to be, or where we want to be trimming. Now, before I start playing with the text box edge, I'm not going to highlight the text because we won't actually see that highlighted part change. But what I'm going to do is on this text box edge, we're going to say that we're going to do my cap, and we're going to, which I think is the default, and then we're going to say we want to do our alphabetic like this. We're going to see that things change a little bit, and it looks more balanced now than it used to. So cap is trimming along the top of our capital letters, and then alphabetic is trimming along the baseline, which is like right where these characters are all sitting. And this is what I think most of the time you're going to do a cap and an alphabetic, but you might switch the top out for an X if you want. It's going to unbalance it in this case because I have all caps, but the X is going on the X height, which is the case of a lowercase x. So the height of your lowercase letters, basically. So do you want to cut off the height of your uppercase letters, or do you want to cut it at the height of your lowercase letters? One or the other. In this case, and I think most cases, this is what you're going to use. And then, as I said, this solves that problem of the unbalanced things. But you'll notice that when I do 0.5 now, it's really, really small. And this is something that's going to happen because we are so used to adding padding to the top and bottom based on that extra space that was already there. The normal values we used to use are going to look really weird. And we can probably just come in with like more singular ones, or if there is a difference, it's going to be a lot smaller than it used to be, depending on the sizing you need. But your top and bottom padding in these cases will always be bigger than what you're used to doing. And this for me is one of the nicest things with spacing that's come along with CSS in a really long time. And just really quickly, as I said, we do have the shorthand, I should say, which is we can just take all of this off and I can put it all together. Trim both, cap, alphabetic, with just my text box there, and it will work. And this, I think, will be a very common thing. Now, I'm going to take it off from here. I'm going to just comment it out for now so it goes away. And what I'm going to do is put it on all the direct descendants of my card. Because, and we'll zoom back out for this one. For cards, often you actually want, as we said, consistent spacing. And right now we don't actually have perfectly consistent spacing. Because if we take and again highlight this font, it's not so noticeable, but our spacing, we have this extra space on the top here. And then my gap is this space that's right here. Let's go and actually highlight that by looking and turning on our dev tools and turning on our grid inspector. And it's not quite, we're sort of in this like middle ground of where my gaps are aligning. But you can see, especially on this lowercase text, there's a lot of space on top of this lowercase text. We really see it there when I highlight it too. On that lowercase text, we have all that empty space along the top, and then we have that gap there. So we don't actually have the equal spacing that we might have thought that we had. So this type of thing might be something you'll do where you select all the direct descendants in a space where you do want consistent spacing, but there are some side effects, and we're going to see those right now where the button all of a sudden breaks. So this is a fun one, and it also, actually two things. It breaks my button, and we'll fix that in a second. I'll explain why. It makes sense once you know why. But also the gap that we had of 1.5 is suddenly really small. And before we fix everything, I just want you to understand why it's so small. Because if we come and take a look, and this is using the cap and the alphabetic once again, is if we take a look at my gaps with my grid inspector now, we're going into the space of those descenders now. So the lowercase l, the g, they're going into that gap because that isn't part of the content sizing anymore. We've trimmed off that from our text. And that means here too, with these ones here, we're going into that space, and you even see like the dot on the I is a little bit up into that space. Visually speaking, we have much more consistent spacing now. The descenders here do throw that off a little bit. So this might be somewhere where you decide you actually want to do just your cap and not change what the spacing on the bottom is. So we're cutting off things at the cap heights, which makes it a little bit better. And that might be what you want. Or you might decide you want both of them, but you're just going to have to come in with a much bigger gap than what you're traditionally used to using. And with the larger sizes there, the spacing actually does look much more consistent, at least to my eye. So the space from here to here matches visually this space, because I don't really want to measure the space from the bottom of the P to the top here, because most of the areas we're looking at, we have this larger space that's here, and that just leads to more consistent spacing overall. But once again, you're using larger numbers than what you're used to. So something that you definitely is going to involve a bit of play and getting used to over time. I'm going to reduce this back down to look at the button that's just overflowing now. And the reason it's overflowing is my button has a lot of padding on it. And that padding is actually overflowing outside of that paragraph that I put it in. Where I said we have that pesky paragraph right there. So that might be an option depending on how you want to do your layouts. And so with this paragraph that's coming in right here, this is getting cut down. But my button isn't, because I only selected all the direct children of my card. So the button isn't getting trimmed in the same way that the paragraph is getting trimmed. So we're reducing the size of the paragraph, but we're still adding all that padding onto the button, and it's just overflowing at the top and the bottom. So this is one of those definite things to watch out for. And one of those potential reasons, as I said, you might not want to put a paragraph down at the end. And then that would just mean on here, I believe it would, let's do justify items. I think it's going to be a start on there. And let's see if I was right. There we go. We can line it up on the start. Just like that. And a lot of the times on this, I do actually do an align content of start as well, just to make sure the content is staying closer to the top. Like if you did have stretching going on, because you have different cards with different amounts of content and they're stretching, this would make sure they don't stretch out. So just an option that could be potentially useful, but at least the items gets us back to where we were. So yeah, looking at spacing from the old school days of having why we have margins on the top and the bottom, continuing with your flow, using M's in areas where you want it, and then how we can get consistent flow with grid and why you might want to use it there, and then some newer tools on how you can improve that as well for hopefully going forward, though we do want to be a little bit careful with it because it will make some new decisions than it comes to our usual spacing that we might be used to using. I hope you enjoyed this video, and of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.